what I really wanted to cover today was Pfizer as one of the sponsors of this research that Dwayne outlined, just where we got to, why we were involved in that, and what were our real interests in there. And as Dwayne presents the information and the focus that emerged in the project on clinical trial recruitment, what we're trying to do at Pfizer is trying to transition the interest in this project into the people who run our clinical trials innovation group, the people who are working on adaptive licensing. So the application of the work and where to take it next is in slightly different teams from where it originated. Because the interest in this project originated in the real world data group that I was at the time working with. And I think what we'd seen was we had ideas about the kinds of data we would love to see, broad population, really deep information, very consented and anonymised research. That's, we'd love to have that kind of information, but we weren't going to get it. And I think the OECD presentation really confirms that we're not going to get it everywhere, we're not going to get it in some key countries, and we're not going to get it for a while. But what I think comes across very strongly when you look at the area is that despite things not being perfect, there is a lot happening. There are a lot of experimentation, a lot of new projects, there are a lot of new data sources being collected. There are some countries which are doing a great job. So there's a lot of mix of things which are actually happening within that context, which can sometimes seem a bit complex and slow and constrained. So Pfizer did some work with a different group with RAND and IBM a few years ago, which looked at what was actually happening in Europe about experiments and the use of real-world data. And that project threw up some good examples, but also kind of chunked it down into saying that there are three kinds of data sets that are being created. So there is the broad population electronic health record information, broad population coverage, sometimes limited data within that, sometimes limited access for private companies to interrogate and use that, but those data sets are being created. And then there are disease-specific registries, and again that gives you slightly different information. It's people recruited by a clinician, deep information stored on a disease over time, so useful if you're very interested in that disease and that disease only, less interesting if you're trying to do some more epidemiology or if you've got a molecular marker that's present across multiple diseases, but potentially a good source of information. And then there's the kind of information that we heard about earlier, the patient-led information, where again, you've got hugely deep information potentially about individual patients, but it's self-selecting, so you don't know what diseases are going to be covered. Some of our regulatory and clinical trials data folks would say, well, what's the quality of the information there? A question you could pose of all of those things. But there are, again, it could be brilliant, but may have different limitations. And what we were really interested in is if countries and groups and diseases are going to progress at different rates in implementing those kinds of data sets, what can we do? What is the difference for us in terms of achieving the aspirations that we have as a company of accessing data between those different models? So would the electronic health records, or if you didn't have electronic health records, could you not do what you wanted? What's the difference between those different models in terms of our objectives? And we wanted to test that against something measurable, and the identification of patients for trials is a great example. So Dwayne and we worked with CPRD and others, I think did a great job of turning those general questions, and there are multiple aspirations and needs for accessing data, into something measurable that we could use. So the results, I think, are really great. That being said, we're not particularly interested in the absolute figures that are being presented. We've only ever really been interested in the difference, the delta that would make to us. So when I've talked to our clinical trial innovation group, they're not worried about the dollar figure, but they know that if they can speed things up, that's good, and for multiple reasons. So I think it's a very useful study. I think for me, it leads to a number of research questions for additional work. So I think one's been raised already about, can you use these databases for delivering kind of real-world efficacy data? Does the capacity of these different systems to identify patients also lead you to collection of information in a different domain? I think, that, again, Dwayne has mentioned it, and Mark also raised the question, is can we turn speedier identification of patients into genuinely faster recruitment and earlier starts of studies? And that's a huge issue. And again, I think maybe the other limitation, but good for a first step in this area, is to average, because it's average data across many things, there may be very big differences in that identification to recruitment. And so it's, again, it feels like we need more hands-on experiments to try and see how this plays out in different domains. One other question for me is, can we actually live with fewer trial centres? I mean, it sounds great, but actually, particularly if you're looking at the relative effectiveness domain and post-approval evidence, we're being asked for quite a lot of local variance. And so you may have efficiencies on one side, which then loses what you're trying to deliver on another. And there may be other drivers for not consolidating all of your studies on one site. So another project Pfizer's involved in the US is about, can we do more studies away from the traditional big sites, but also in areas where we can access minority ethnic populations for studies, because those are typically disenfranchised from participation and evidence because they're not living near the big trial centres. So I just would be reluctant to say that the early data necessarily map into what you might think. I think impact of competition is another thing. One other very interesting area here for me is, if you can speed up recruitment and potentially speed up studies, what does that mean for decision making within companies? I think there's been some debate already. Does that mean we do essentially the same thing and have a lower price? But I think there's a lot of interest in what else that might open up. I've done a lot of work on Pfizer's rare disease portfolio. There's a number of reasons why you don't study particular rare diseases. You might not be able to identify the patients at all. And secondly, the time span of your trials may be too long. So it may change the mix of research. So I think that would be another interesting thing to consider for us. And then the final point about if you can offset costs, which would be wonderful, I think just a kind of old lag, I can say now, 9 years in the pharmaceutical industry, you often see offset costs in one area just being swamped by cost increases elsewhere. High throughput screening saved us loads of money, but actually the total drug development cost didn't go down because other factors are in the way. So I think in terms of the adaptive licensing work, when you're looking at the overall picture, I think that the overall cost of delivering that information is as important as the little pieces of it. But I think the study's great, and I really enjoyed working with Dwayne and others on it. So I think it's a good report.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you. Thank you. So Adam certainly gives us a lot of